What's up, everybody? Andrew Mahone here with Darium's Competitive Pokemon. Today, going to be talking about Metagross GX. This deck is really good. I think it's very strong in the current standard format, and this deck just has a lot to offer. I mean, Metagross GX is a huge Pokemon. Now that the format is in the place that it is, with Stage 2 decks really at an advantage, just being big, having the time to set up, and just being able to execute their strategies without having to worry too much about item lock or anything like that. Metagross GX just definitely has a lot of potential. Huge 250 hit points. Metagross GX acts as not only your support Pokemon with Geotech systems, as your setup Pokemon, it can set up with Algorithm GX, but it's also your main attacker. This deck has a lot to offer. Not only does it have a great Gardevoir GX matchup, it's just also a very self-sustaining archetype. Once this thing gets up and rolling, it is very difficult to stop. I think Metagross GX as an archetype has a lot of potential and could definitely do well at the upcoming regional championships in Connecticut. I'm pretty confident in this list. I've been testing it quite a bit, and I think this list could definitely go the distance in the right hands at the upcoming regional. So let's check it out. My list starts off with 4 copies of Metagross GX, 3 copies of Metang, and 4 copies of Beldum. We also play 1 copy of Necrozma GX, 1 copy of Vulpix, and 3 copies of Tapu Lele, and that's it. You can see our cast here is pretty light. I mean, we don't have any of the extra bells and whistles like Artillery, no Oranguru, only 1 copy of Vulpix, which I'll explain here in a minute, and only 1 copy of Necrozma GX, but I think that this is your ideal cast for a Metagross GX deck. Metagross GX, like I said before, is not only your support Pokemon, but he's also your main attacker and also a great setup Pokemon. So we're going to play 4 copies of Metagross GX, and that's kind of a no-brainer since we want to get as many Metagross GX into play as possible during the course of a game, and we can't really afford to prize any. Metagross GX sets up the field with Geotech Systems. Geotech Systems is an ability that reads, once during your turn before you attack, you may attach a Psychic or a Metal energy card from your discard pile to your active Pokemon. So anyone who is familiar with Electric, Metagross GX is kind of a reverse Electric. Instead of using Dynamotor, which accelerates a Lightning energy card from the discard pile to the bench, Geotech Systems accelerates a Metal or a Psychic energy card from your own discard pile to your active. And accelerating to the active is absolutely amazing. I mean, this is an awesome ability, and just being able to accelerate 2 types means that you have options as far as being able to use some secondary attackers as well, like Necrozma and Tapu Lele GX. The main attack in this deck is going to be Giga Hammer, though, which costs 2 metal energy and a colorless. Giga Hammer does 150 base damage, and the effect of the attack reads, this Pokemon can't use Giga Hammer during your next turn. That might seem like quite a drawback since this does have a fat retreat cost of 3. However, you never really have to worry too much about the drawback of Giga Hammer because you're going to accelerate to the Metagross, use Giga Hammer, and then most of the time you will just retreat to another Metagross, and since Geotech Systems accelerates to the active, you will just accelerate the 2 or 3 energy that you just retreated off to the new active. If you only have 2 Metagross in play, you're only going to be accelerating 2 energy to the new active Pokemon, but then you could just manually attach an energy from hand, and you have another Giga Hammer attack. Since there is no, Hex Maniac in this format, Giga Hammer is very easy to stream back to back. And if your opponent whiffs a 1-hit knockout on Metagross GX and they just have to do some damage to it, the Metagross GX that you attacked with in the last turn will simply retreat to the bench, and you can leave it there for a while you attack with some fresh Metagross GX, and then maybe you can hit a max potion or something like that later in the game while you're attacking with fresh attackers. So this is very good tank deck. I mean, this is pretty much your quintessential tank deck. 250 hit points is absolutely gargantuan. The last thing I want to talk about as far as Metagross GX goes is this Algorithm GX attack, which is absolutely insane for setting up your board position. Algorithm GX just costs 1 colorless energy, so you can have just 1 Metagross GX up in play. Maybe you can Geotech Systems to it if you have an energy in the discard pile, or just attach manually for turn. And as long as you got some Beldums or something on the bench, Algorithm GX is just going to be an absolutely awesome play. If you got some Beldums on the bench, you can use Algorithm GX to search your deck for up to 5 cards and put them into your hand. So Algorithm GX reads, search your deck for up to 5 cards, put them into your hand, and then shuffle your deck. If you have Beldums on the bench, you're going to be searching for things like Rare Candy Metagross, and maybe a Professor Sycamore, something like that. Algorithm GX easily sets up multiple Metagross GX and is absolutely amazing for getting this deck jump started and into action. We do play 3 copies of Metang in this list just because it's absolutely essential that we get as many Metagross GX into play as possible. If we're only playing 1 or 2 copies of Metang, odds are we won't be finding them very easily, and then if we can't find our rare candies, we're really going to be struggling to get afloat, and we're not going to be doing much of anything. So much like a Gardevoir GX deck that wants to play a very thick line of Gardevoir GX, Metagross GX also wants to play a very thick line of Metagross GX. A 4-3-4 I have found to be very optimal in my testing. And that's because Metagross GX, like I said, not only your supporter, but also your main attacker. So you need to keep as many of them in play as you can. We only play 1 copy of Necrozma GX, who is really good in this deck, but it definitely is not as good as Metagross GX, and I'm going to talk about why. We only play 1 copy of Necrozma GX because Necrozma GX has a retreat cost of 2. And you might notice that everybody else in the deck, all of our other basics, have a retreat cost of 1. So Necrozma GX start is actually pretty much the worst starter that you can have in the deck because a lot of the times you're going to be using Bridget and you want to retreat into a turn 1 Vulpix so that you can beacon to set up your board position. You'll notice that I am only playing 1 copy of Alolan Vulpix, and that's because I've opted to play 2 copies of Bridget, and I don't really think that Alolan Vulpix is needed. You don't ever really need more than 1, and I think with 2 copies of Bridget and 1 copy of Vulpix, you have a very high chance of getting the Alolan Vulpix start. Anyway, if you were to play 2 copies of Alolan Vulpix and only maybe 1 copy of Bridget, I feel like you would get the turn 1 Bridget less. And to me, the more important part of setting this deck up is getting the turn 1 Bridget, not necessarily the turn 1 Vulpix. But and also, you're not going to be getting the turn 1 Vulpix or an early Vulpix at all if you happen to start Necrozma GX, which is pretty annoying. So that's why we only play 1 copy of Necrozma GX. 1 Vulpix is a little bit of a consolation. This deck is very tight on space, but I think 1 copy of Alolan Vulpix is important. You're not going to be starting it every game, and that's okay. I mean, sometimes you're going to be going in with Metagross GX to use Algorithm GX in order to set up your board position. So I think for that reason, the fact that you can set up with Metagross or Vulpix really warrants just the 1 of Vulpix. You don't need 2 Vulpix. You could set up with Metagross GX if you don't happen to get Vulpix up in the active. If you start Necrozma, you're not going to be getting either of these guys into the active position anytime soon anyway. So 1 on both of these is just fine. I play a copy of Rescue Stretcher so that we can get more than 1 Necrozma GX out throughout the course of the game if it happens to be a really good attacker in the matchup that you're playing, but I think only 1 hard copy of Necrozma is absolutely the correct play. We do play Necrozma GX in here because of that Prismatic Burst attack. Prismatic Burst allows you to discard all psychic energy from this Pokemon, and the attack does 60 more damage for each card you discard in this way. So it does a perfect 190 damage if you discard 3 psychic energies, which is absolutely great, right? Because this does a 1-hit knockout against Ho-Oh, a 1-hit knockout against Turtonator GX, and a 1-hit knockout against also Volcanion EX, which is definitely your worst matchup. So Necrozma GX is going to be getting out there and really helping your team out against fire decks or just against Pokemon that require, more than 180 damage to knock out. If you're going, because Metagross GX really caps out at 180 damage with the Choice Band that we play. So with Choice Band, and 3 psychic energies, you're going to be doing 220 damage with Necrozma GX. You could even get a 4th psychic energy on here, and you would be doing 250 damage with a Choice Band. That's 280 damage. Necrozma GX is capable of one-shotting anything that's relevant in the entire format. So Necrozma GX, very, very effective in this deck to help you get over that damage ceiling that is just cut off so low with Metagross GX at 150. So Necrozma GX really pulls a lot of weight in here. He does have that useful Lights End ability, which is, situationally useful against pretty much Drampa and Tauros are really the only two colorless Pokemon that come to mind immediately that you're going to want to avoid taking damage from with this deck, but you don't really have problems with too many of those decks anyway, so Lights End won't too much come into play. You could use Black Ray GX against decks that maybe have that high damage ceiling that you can't really hit. So maybe against a deck like Solgaleo GX, right, where all those Solgaleos have like 250 hit points, you might go in with Black Ray GX and do 100 damage to everything, and then try to clean up shop with Metagross GX. Similarly, in the mirror match, you might go in with a Black Ray GX and do 100 damage to everything, and then try to sweep up with Metagross GX. But Black Ray GX is not really going to be getting as much use as Metagross GX's Algorithm GX does. That tech is absolutely awesome. Even though it gets end away sometimes, Algorithm GX, when it sticks, really, really gets this deck to explode. Of course, we do play Tapu Lele GX in this deck. You can see that we don't play any Octillery or Rangaroo, but Tapu Lele GX helps us not only to get our Bridgets to start off the game, helps us get our Guzmas to capitalize on opponents, benched Tapu Leles and things like that we can knock out with no problem, but also is an additional attacker in this deck. You can use Energy Drive, Accelerate Energy to your Tapu Lele GX. It also acts as an alternative non-fire weak Pokemon. So it does help against Volcanion and things like that. Just an awesome additional attacker to have. Against some decks, you can also go in with the Tapu Cure GX. Since we do play Psychic Energy, that is an option for us too. But Tapu Lele GX, obviously here primarily for that Wonder Tag ability. Just to help us hand select the supporters that we want out of the deck so that we can get them into play, whether it be Skyla or Bridget or Guzma, Sycamore or N. Tapu Lele GX really helps piece this entire archetype together. Speaking of the supporters, let's get right down to our supporter counts for this archetype. We are playing 4 copies of Professor Sycamore. You really want to get your energy into the discard pile early so that you can use Metagross's Geotech systems to accelerate it to your active Pokemon. And Professor Sycamore is just a great hard draw card. We need to be playing 4 of these, especially since we're not playing any other way to draw cards in this deck like a Rangaroo or Octillery. We do play 4 copies of N as well, just the second best supporter in format, maybe even arguably the best supporter in format since some decks are not playing a full suit of Sycamore anymore. N is just fantastic for disrupting the opponent at the end of the game and also for getting set up in the early game. Play 3 copies of Guzma. Our Metagross GX are very big, very beefy, and hard to move out of the active. If we don't have, especially if we don't have our abilities, in play. So you may use Guzma to knock out an opponent's Garbodor. That's one thing to use. You could use it to get your Metagross out of the active position, especially if they have some sort of status condition or something like that. Guzma is great for picking off the opponent's Tapu Lele GX too. Almost every deck is playing multiple copies of Tapu Lele GX. Metagross GX really abuses Tapu Lele GX, knocks it out very easily with a choice band. And since Guzma, makes you switch your own Pokemon, it's never really a problem since you can accelerate to your active position from anywhere on your board with Metagross GX. Guzma is just always a very good card. And it actually operates in this list way better than Lysander ever would, just because the switching is almost never a drawback for you. The switching always works out. You always have ways to accelerate your energy. Guzma is just a fantastic card in this list. To round out the supporters, we play 2 copies of Bridget and 1 copy of Skyla. I would like to play more than 1 copy of Skyla in this list. However, 1 copy of Skyla will do. Skyla is just great to Tapu Lele for. After you've Bridgeted, maybe you have a Metagross GX in your hand. You can Tapu Lele for a Skyla, right? You're one of Skyla. Grab that rare candy, evolve your active into Metagross GX, and then you can Algorithm GX, right? You can use Algorithm GX, refill your hand to 5, any 5 cards you want out of your deck. Skyla is really good for that. Skyla is just very good for putting stage 2 Pokemon into play. That's her primary job in this deck. You could play more than one copy, but one copy does the job just fine since you're really only going to be using it in that niche kind of situation. Sometimes you're going to be using Skyla also to grab a choice band, but we play a lot of choice bands in this deck, and you could definitely draw into them with more hard draw cards like Professor Sycamore. We could play more copies of Skyla in this list. I would like 2 or 3 copies. However, the list is very tight, and instead of playing 2 copies of Skyla, I opted for 2 copies of Bridget. I think that the Bridget play turn 1 is just so essential to getting this deck set up and running smoothly that I would love to play 2 copies of it, so I do. I mean, whiffing the turn 1 Bridget, prizing Bridget, or just not opening it really slows this deck down. The deck really wants to get as many Beldum into play turn 1 as possible. With 3 copies of Tapu Lele GX and 2 copies of Bridget, 4 copies of Ultra Ball, you really start turn 1 Bridget all the time. I mean, it's feasible with this many outs to a turn 1 Bridget to open Bridget almost every single match of a tournament, which is pretty much my main reason for playing 2. You really only have, it's something like maybe a 60% probability of opening a turn 1 Bridget with only 1 copy of Bridget in deck, and playing 2 copies raises it to more like a 70%. And even just that 10%, that 5 or 10%, might be something like 65 to 70, or somewhere between 60 and 70%. But even that small amount of percentage makes a big difference when multiplied over the course of a long tournament. I mean, and we're talking about a card that makes or breaks the difference between a game won and a game loss. I mean, a lot of times if you have to start with a turn 1 N or a turn 1 Sycamore instead of the turn 1 Bridget, and you whiff your copies of Beldum, you're going to be going off to a rough start. It's going to be very hard for you to rebound against more aggressive decks like Volcanion and Gardevoir. If your opponent does start the turn 1 Bridget and you don't, you're really going to be in the back foot, and it's going to be very hard to pull off a win. So I'm a big fan of 2 copies of Bridget. I know it's kind of a contended issue right now in the TCG. Do you only play 1 copy? Do you only play 2? It's up to you guys. I mean, really, you know my opinion. This is my opinion. But, you know, my opinion is also not fact, and it could go either way. So if you're looking for a free spot, you could be a little greedy and cut your second copy of Bridget, maybe if you wanted to play another copy of Skyla or something else. But that is personal preference. Up to you guys. You know, let me know what you think of 1 to 2 Bridget in the comments below if you're interested in joining in on the discussion on that. As far as the items go, we play 4 copies of Ultra Ball, 4 copies of Rare Candy, 4 copies of Choice Band, 3 copies of Max Potion, 3 copies of Field Blower, 1 copy of Rescue Stretcher, and 1 copy of Professor's Letter. I love the consistency of this list. I mean, just look at all the 4-ofs we have. 4 copies of Rare Candy, going to be getting our Metagross GX up into play as quickly as possible, and I really like 4 Rare Candy to do that. I mean, in an environment where we have Volcanion decks running around, Garbodor decks running around, you really want to be able to get as many Metagross GX into play as fast as possible, and I think 4 Rare Candy really helps us do that. I mean, I can't really think of any good reason to only play 3. Yes, you can algorithm for your Rare Candies if you want to, but I think just why not give yourself the most consistent chance to get as many Metagross GX into play as you can, since you need more than 1 Metagross GX in play. I mean, Gardevoir can sometimes get away with just having 1 Gardevoir GX in play early, and you could kind of poke away and attack with it while you set up your bench Gardevoirs. Metagross GX is not that way. You want to get as many, pretty much need 3 Metagross GX in play in order to have a stable board position. So I really like 4 Rare Candy for that reason. We also play, obviously, 4 copies of Ultra Ball. Going to grab our Tapu Lele GXs. Going to be grabbing the pieces of our puzzles to piece together our Metagross GX as well. 4 copies of Ultra Ball is an absolute mainstay. I am playing 4 copies of Choice Band as well. You don't absolutely need to play 4 copies of Choice Band, but doing 150 damage with Metagross GX is just so bad. You don't really ever want to be doing 150 damage with Metagross GX. I mean, that doesn't knock out anybody. Choice Band is pretty much essential when you're attacking with Metagross GX, and since decks are playing, a healthy amount of Field Blower, I feel like Choice Band is just a very, very good card in this deck, and you're going to be wishing that you had it all the time. So Choice Band, playing 4, you could play 3 if you're looking for another spot. Maybe you wanted to switch to a 4th Max Potion, but I personally like 4 copies of Choice Band in this list. Just doing the difference between 180 and 150 damage is the difference, quite frankly, between winning a game and not winning a game. So I do like 4 copies. 3 copies of Max Potion. Some lists are going to play 4, but I feel like 3 is just enough. You don't really need Max Potion early. You only need Max Potion once you're up and running. You can Skyla for your Max Potion. You can Algorithm GX for your Max Potion. You know, if you're doing the Algorithm GX play, you know you're about to get smacked one. One of your cards might be a Max Potion. If you already have a Draw Supporter in hand, you might go like Rare Candy Metagross, Max Potion, sitting on a Professor Sycamore. These plays are really strong. Max Potion just really contributes to the tankability of this deck as well. 250 hit points is very, very difficult to take down. So, like I said, Metagross GX is going to be taking a lot of hits, and you are going to be able to glance them off with Max Potion, which is very annoying. You just have to make sure, that you play your Max Potions, responsibly and appropriately, save them for the right time. But there's pretty much no way to mess this up. Healing your Metagross GX for big damage is always good, and I think 3 copies of Max Potion is just right for it. We also played 3 copies of Field Blower because Garbodor really messes with this deck. You really don't want to have to run into Garbodor when you're playing this deck, but Field Blower is pretty much the best way to deal with it. So we do play 3 copies. You can Skyla for your copy of Field Blower, but we do play enough. 3 copies is just enough to draw into them naturally, and I really like that. They also remove Fighting Fury Belts, which are very annoying, especially on Volcanion decks. A lot of times it's very hard to get over that hump. To knock out those beefy, 230 hit point Pokemon in Volcanion once they have those Fighting Fury Belts equipped. 190 hit points plus the 40 from Fighting Fury Belt. Very hard to hit that 230, even with your Necrozma GX. Field Blower makes it so it's much more manageable Pokemon to knock out. Necrozma GX can easily hit, 190 damage with 3 Psychic Energy. 230, not so much. So Field Blower, great against Garbodor, great against Volcanion, great against any Pokemon playing Fighting Fury Belt, since you are built to do 180 damage or maybe 190 damage with Necrozma, but not really that much more. And we do play 1 copy of Rescue Stretcher. You could play a 2nd copy of Rescue Stretcher in here if you wanted to. 1 is the bare minimum. You definitely want to play at least 1 to get your Metagrosses back. If you have to Sycamore a lot of pieces of your Metagross line just to get set up early, or if you want to get your Necrozma GX back, Rescue Stretcher helps you do those things. So it's really good for that. You could play 2 copies just to give yourself a little bit more of a reflexive deck that you can discard things and just bring them right back into play very easily. But 1 copy works just fine and has been sufficient in my testing. We are playing 1 copy of Professor's Letter as well. You don't need to play this card, but I really like it in here because it's just very good for setting up your Necrozma GX. Necrozma GX really only works well with Psychic Energy to use that Prismatic Burst attack. So you're going to want to get 3 copies of your Psychic Energy onto Necrozma GX. Professor's Letter helps you search out those Psychic Energies and get them in the discard pile so they can be accelerated to your Necrozma even easier. And I really like Professor's Letter in here. It's done me wonders as far as getting those 1-hit knockouts with Necrozma, and could just be the little bit of an edge you need against a Volcanion deck to be able to take some crucial knockouts with Necrozma, which is something he absolutely has to do in that matchup. That's it for the items. As far as the energy goes, we do play 6 copies of Metal, which I think is pretty much as low as I would go. I've seen, you could play 7, but I think 6 works just fine, and 4 copies of Psychic. So we do play our 4 copies of Psychic, since you're going to want 3 on a Necrozma GX to do 190. 6 copies of Metal is fine. You don't need any more than that, since Metagross's GX attack only costs 2 Metal and 1 colorless, so you can use the Psychic to satisfy the colorless requirement. The Professor's Letter really helps, you draw into the energy that you need in order to pull off the appropriate attack. So I really like the 1 copy of Professor's Letter in here, just so you're not awkwardly only drawing in to your Metal Energy when you want to attack with Necrozma, and you're not awkwardly only drawing into your Psychic Energy when you want to attack with Metagross. It really helps split the difference there. So that's it for my Metagross GX deck. Really excited to continue testing with it. Let me know what you all think of Metagross GX in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Peace.